In the Montana Territory, the autumn of 1887 was a season of frantic preparation. Men with sun-cracked hands and steel in their eyes worked from dawn until dusk, their axes ringing a sharp, metallic rhythm against the cold air. They were felling lodgepole pine, notching logs, and raising cabins against the coming winter, a winter that was always spoken of in hushed, predatory terms. Among them was a man named Silas Thorne, but he was not building like the others. While his neighbors raised their walls toward the sky, Silas dug down into the earth. He was a quiet man, an immigrant whose Cornish accent was as thick and unfamiliar as the strange work he was undertaking. With a pick and shovel, he had carved a shallow rectangular basin into the hard-packed soil where his cabin would stand, a full 2 feet deep across its entire expanse. The other settlers, hardened men who had learned their craft from their fathers, would stop their work and watch. They saw him haul wagon load after wagon load of lump charcoal from the distant railroad kilns, the black, dusty cargo staining his clothes and skin. He wasn't using it for a forge or a smokehouse. He was meticulously, painstakingly filling the pit he had dug, creating a vast black bed beneath his future home. Elias Vance, the region's most respected carpenter, a man whose dovetailed joints were things of local legend, finally strode over one afternoon. He watched Silas rake the black stones level. "Silas," he said, his voice laced with genuine concern, "that ground will heave with the frost. Your foundation will be a pile of splinters by spring." Silas Thorne barely looked up from his work. The ground will sleep," he replied, his voice low. The activity was so bizarre, so contrary to every piece of hard-won frontier wisdom, that it became a local spectacle, a source of grim amusement. They gave it a name. They called it Thorne's Folly. The men at the trading post would joke about it over barrels of nails and sacks of flour. They said Silas was trying to plant a crop of coal, or that he was so afraid of the cold he was trying to build his cabin halfway to hell. But Silas Thorne, a man who had spent 20 years in the deep, damp tin mines of Cornwall, kept working. He knew things about the earth that these men of the forest could not. He understood the slow, silent wars waged by water and cold in the darkness underground. What did this quiet miner understand about survival that every experienced woodsman in the valley had missed? The answer would arrive with the fury of an Arctic ghost, and it would change the way they all lived. If you want to see more forgotten wisdom brought to light, subscribe to this channel right now, because the story of Thorne's Folly is a masterclass in how the craziest ideas can become gospel. To understand Silas Thorne's madness, you first have to understand the enemy. In Montana, the enemy wasn't just the cold. The cold was a straightforward brute. You could fight it with fire and thick walls. The true killer was something more insidious. It was the damp. It was a living thing, born from the temperature differential between the frigid air and the warmer, moist earth. It crept upwards, through the soil, and through the stone piers, and into the very bones of a cabin. Conventional wisdom dictated that a cabin should be raised off the ground on stone footings to keep the sill logs from rotting. It was a sensible idea, born from centuries of building in gentler climates, but here it was a catastrophic failure. The stone piers acted like wicks, drawing the deep, relentless cold of the frozen earth directly into the wood. The floor joists resting on these frozen stones became conduits of frost. The air under the cabin, trapped and stagnant, would become saturated with moisture rising from the ground. This moisture would then condense on the underside of the frigid floorboards, coating them in a layer of frost and ice. The result was a home that was a torture chamber of dampness. A perpetual, bone-aching chill radiated up from the floor. No matter how high the fire roared, leather boots would grow a skin of green mildew in the corners. Blankets, even those piled high on a bed, felt clammy and heavy. The air itself was thick with the smell of wet wool, damp earth, and the faint, sweet scent of incipient rot. Families burned through their precious, hard-cut firewood at a terrifying rate, not just for warmth, but in a desperate, losing battle against the damp. The heat from the stove would rise, while the cold and wetness pooled around their ankles. Children were constantly sick with coughs and fevers that lingered for months. It wasn't uncommon for the ink to freeze in the wells on the writing desk, or for a skin of ice to form on a bucket of water just a few feet from a glowing hot stove. This was the accepted reality. It was the price of admission for living in this beautiful, unforgiving land. The settlers fought it, they endured it, but they did not know how to defeat it. Silas Thorne knew. His knowledge wasn't from a book or a university. It was etched into his lungs and the scars on his hands. For 2 decades he had worked in the Cornish tin mines, deep shafts that plunged thousands of feet into the wet, granitic crust of the earth. Down there, water was a constant presence. Humidity was 100% year-round, and rot was a swift and deadly enemy. He had seen timber props, massive oak beams meant to hold back thousands of tons of rock, turn to spongy punk in a matter of months when set directly into the wet ground. But he had also seen the solution, the old ways. The mine captains knew that if you set those same oak props into a deep footing of pure wood charcoal, they would last for a century. In the mines, charcoal was life. It was packed into vents to absorb the toxic choke damp gas. It was used to filter drinking water, and most importantly, it was used to manage moisture. Silas had spent his youth in darkness, watching, learning how this black, porous material could breathe. He had felt with his own hands how a wall of charcoal could feel dry to the touch, while the rock face behind it was weeping with water. When he looked at the cabins of the Montana Territory, he didn't see sturdy homes. He saw mine shafts turned upside down. He saw men building their houses on a foundation of the very enemy they were trying to escape. He saw the damp, the rot, and the sickness. And he knew he would not make the same mistake. His family would not suffer the slow siege of a wet winter. He was going to build a house that breathed. The construction of Thorne's Folly was a methodical, deliberate process that flew in the face of every local tradition. After digging his 2-foot-deep basin, Silas began the laborious task of laying the charcoal. It wasn't just dumped. He spread it with a heavy rake, walking over the black, crunchy surface in his heavy boots, tamping it down lightly until he had a perfectly level 2-foot-thick bed of blackness. The sheer volume was staggering. It took him weeks. His neighbors saw the growing black pit and shook their heads. They saw a waste of time, a waste of money spent on charcoal that could have been used for smithing, and a waste of perfectly good earth. Next came a step that baffled them even more. Silas acquired several massive bolts of thick, tarred canvas, the kind used to cover cargo on ships or railroad flatbeds. It was expensive and hard to come by. He carefully unrolled it over the entire surface of the charcoal bed, overlapping the seams by a good 2 feet and sealing them with hot tar he boiled in a kettle over an open fire. He had created a dark, waterproof membrane separating the charcoal from the future living space. Only then did he begin to build in a way the others recognized. He set his foundation piers, flat-topped stones, directly onto the tarred canvas. But his placement was precise. Upon these stones he laid his main sill logs and floor joists. The critical detail, invisible to a casual observer, was the gap. He had engineered a 6-inch airspace between the top of the tarred canvas and the bottom of his floorboards. It was a hidden cavity, a plenum of air resting above a sea of charcoal. The final and perhaps most ridiculed element came when he was raising the walls. At the base of the foundation, on the north and south sides of the cabin, he installed small sliding vents, no bigger than a man's hand. They were covered with fine wire mesh to keep out rodents and insects. To his neighbors, this was the ultimate act of lunacy, building a house to keep out the cold, only to deliberately cut holes in it at floor level. It was at this point that Elias Vance made his most forceful intervention. He was not a malicious man. He was the community's expert, and he felt a duty to prevent a neighbor from endangering his family. He found Silas fitting one of the small wooden vents into the massive sill log. "Silas, for the love of God, what are you doing?" Vance's voice was strained with disbelief. "You're inviting drafts. You're building a sieve. Every snake and mouse in this valley will make a home under your floor." Silas looked at the vent, then at Vance. "The house must breathe," he said simply. "Breathe what?" "Arctic air," Vance shot back, his frustration boiling over. "That black dust of yours will hold the damp of the summer rains, and in winter it will freeze into a solid block of ice right under your feet. That tarred sheet will trap the moisture, and these vents," he gestured wildly. "You're just giving the cold a doorway into your home. I've built 17 cabins in this territory. I know what works. This is not it." Silas slid the vent into its housing. It moved with a smooth, satisfying friction. "I'm trying to keep my family warm," was his only reply. He offered no complex defense, no engineering argument. His quiet persistence was more infuriating to Vance than any loud debate would have been. The mockery from the community intensified. At the church social, women would whisper to Silas's wife, Elara, asking if she wasn't worried about the dampness and the vermin. Men would slap Silas on the back at the trading post and ask if he'd struck any good veins of coal under his floor yet. The cabin became a landmark of foolishness. "Go a mile past Thorn's Folly and turn left," people would say. Silas and his family finished the cabin just as the first snows began to fall. From the outside, it looked like any other, a sturdy structure of well-notched pine. But underneath, hidden from view, was the system, the secret lung. Here is how it worked. It was a masterpiece of passive engineering, born from the hard-won physics of the mines. The charcoal was the first and most crucial element. Wood charcoal is incredibly porous. A single gram of it can have a surface area of over 500 square meters. Silas's 2-foot thick bed, covering an area of nearly 600 square feet, represented an almost unimaginable internal surface area. It was a gigantic sponge, but a sponge for water vapor. Throughout the wet spring and humid summer, it would act as a massive desiccant. Any moisture rising from the earth would be absorbed by the charcoal long before it could reach the wooden structure of the house. The ground beneath the cabin was kept perpetually, unnaturally dry. With the vents open during the summer, gentle air circulation, driven by daily temperature changes, would allow the charcoal to slowly release this captured moisture back into the atmosphere. But its winter function was the true genius. When the cold set in, Silas would close the vents. This trapped a large volume of air in the 6-inch gap above the charcoal and within the charcoal bed itself. The earth deep below the frost line maintains a relatively stable temperature around 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This slight geothermal warmth would radiate upwards, warming the vast, dry charcoal bed. The charcoal, now dry and full of trapped air pockets, became a magnificent insulator. The tarred canvas prevented any moisture from inside the house, spills, condensation from cooking, from getting down into the charcoal. And the 6-inch air gap itself was the final masterstroke. It was a buffer zone, a thermal break. Any cold that managed to penetrate the foundation walls would be met by this layer of stable, dry, and gently warmed air. Silas hadn't built a cabin on a pile of dirt. He had built it on a massive, passive, geothermal climate control system. It was an engine powered by the quiet, constant heat of the planet itself. An engine that the other settlers, with their eyes fixed on the sky and the trees, had never thought to look for. That year, winter did not creep in. It fell from the sky like a hammer blow. December brought heavy snow, but it was January of 1888 that would be spoken of for generations. A mass of Arctic air, a polar vortex of a scale no one had ever seen, descended from the north and settled over the territory. The old-timers called it the Great White Winter. The temperature didn't just drop, it evaporated. At dawn one Tuesday, the thermometer outside the general store read 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. By sunset, it was 24 below. The mercury froze and retreated into the bulb. For 2 weeks, the cold was absolute. It was a dry, predatory cold that leached the life from everything it touched. The air was so still and dense, it seemed to crackle. The simple act of breathing outdoors was painful, a searing intake of icy needles. Great lodgepole pines, 100 feet tall, would split open with a sound like a rifle shot as the sap inside them froze and expanded. The sound would echo for miles across the frozen, silent valleys. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, life became a desperate, primal struggle for survival. The cold was an invading army. It poured through the floorboards, a relentless tide of frigid damp. The frost that had once been a nuisance became a thick, menacing armor of ice, growing inwards from the corners of the rooms. It coated the inside of the walls, sometimes an inch thick, sparkling with a cruel beauty in the lamplight. Blankets froze solid to the walls they touched. Water left in a bucket more than 5 feet from the stove would be solid ice within an hour. Families abandoned their bedrooms, huddling together in the single main room, wrapped in every piece of clothing and bedding they owned. The war was fought on a single front, the wood stove. They fed the fires with a frantic desperation. The stoves, designed for steady heat, were pushed to their limits, their iron sides glowing a dull, angry red. The stovepipes became cherry hot, a constant fire hazard. They were burning through their winter woodpiles at a rate that induced panic. A cord of wood, meant to last 2 weeks, was gone in 4 days. When the easily accessible wood ran out, they began to burn anything: fence posts, barn doors, spare furniture, a broken wagon wheel, a child's crib. Elias Vance, the master builder, suffered the most. His pride was a source of additional torment. His cabin, the best-built structure in the valley, with its tight seams and perfectly fitted roof, was a frozen tomb. The stone piers he had so carefully laid were conducting the savage cold directly into the heart of his home. A thick, opaque layer of ice was creeping across his floor, starting from the outside walls and advancing towards the center of the room. His children coughed constantly, and their breath crystallizing in the air before them. He sat by his roaring stove, feeding it precious split pine, and felt the cold seeping up through the soles of his boots. He was the expert. He was the one everyone trusted, and his expertise was worthless. The cold mocked his craft, peeling apart his joints with frost and turning his solid floor into a sheet of ice. And in his misery a thought began to gnaw at him, a terrible guilt-ridden thought. Silas Thorne, the fool with the black pit under his house. What was happening in that cabin? Vance envisioned the worst. He imagined Thorne's foolish charcoal bed, saturated with autumn damp, now frozen into a solid block, a glacier of ice beneath the floor. He pictured the family, huddled and freezing, their firewood gone, betrayed by the strange ideas of their patriarch. The thought became an unbearable weight. Had he, Elias Vance, the community leader, stood by and let a man's pride kill his family? He had mocked him, dismissed him, but he had not truly intervened. The possibility that the Thorne family might be freezing to death, alone in their folly, was a burden his conscience could no longer bear. He had to go. He had to see. The journey to Thorne's cabin was only a quarter of a mile, but it was a journey through a different world. Elias Vance prepared as if for an Arctic expedition. He pulled on a second pair of wool trousers, wrapped his feet in oilcloth before putting on his felt-lined boots, and donned a heavy buffalo hide coat. He wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were exposed. Stepping outside was like stepping onto the surface of another planet. The air didn't feel cold. It felt solid. It resisted his movement. Each breath was a painful, searing gasp that seemed to freeze his lungs from the inside out. The moisture in his eyelashes began to freeze instantly, and he had to continually blink to keep his eyes from sealing shut. The snow under his boots didn't crunch. It shrieked, a high-pitched, crystalline sound, unique to temperatures far below zero. The world was painted in shades of white and blue-gray. The sun was a pale, impotent disk in the sky, offering no warmth, only a harsh, unforgiving light that made the endless snowscape glitter. He leaned into the walk, his own breath freezing on his scarf, creating a growing cage of ice around his mouth. As he neared the Thorne cabin, his anxiety grew. He saw the house, solid and silent against the snow, and he saw something that made his heart plummet. The plume of smoke rising from the chimney was thin, almost non-existent. It was a lazy, gentle wisp, not the thick, churning column of smoke that should be pouring from a chimney when a family was fighting for its life against the cold. A weak fire. That meant they were low on wood, or worse. He stumbled the last few yards, his legs stiff, his face numb. He reached the door and pounded on it with his thickly mittened hand. The sound was a dull, fleshy thud, absorbed by the immense cold. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was preparing himself for what he might find inside. He was composing the words he would say to a grieving widow, or calculating how he would carry the children's frozen bodies back to the settlement. The door swung open, and Elias Vance was hit by a wave. It was not a blast of heat, like the air from a furnace. It was a gentle, pervasive, clean warmth. It washed over him, melting the ice on his scarf, caressing his frozen face. It was the air of a mild October afternoon, not the heart of a killer frost. He blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust, and stumbled across the threshold. The scene before him was impossible. It defied the laws of nature as he understood them. Silas Thorne was sitting in a chair by the hearth, wearing a simple wool shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He was calmly carving a small wooden bird for his daughter. His wife, Alara, stood at a large wooden table. She was kneading dough for a loaf of bread, her arms dusted with flour, also in her shirt sleeves. The air was filled with the warm, yeasty smell of baking, and the children. On the floor, in the center of the room, his two small children, a boy and a girl, were sitting on a bearskin rug, playing with a set of wooden blocks. They were barefoot. Vance stared, his mind refusing to process the information his eyes were delivering. Barefoot children, on a wooden floor, in the middle of the great white winter. He looked around the room as if in a dream. The windows were clear. There was no frost, no condensation. He could see the fury of the swirling snow outside, a world away. He instinctively reached out and touched the log wall next to the door. It was cool, but it was perfectly, miraculously dry. There was no rime of ice, no sheen of frozen damp. He felt a dizzying sense of dislocation, as if he had not simply stepped through a doorway, but between seasons. His entire body, accustomed to the brutal siege of the cold, began to relax in the gentle warmth, and the sensation was so foreign, so welcome, that it almost brought him to his knees. The builder in him took over. His disbelief gave way to a desperate need to understand. He walked, his heavy boots loud in the quiet room, across the floor. It was not cold. It was not even neutral. The floorboards felt faintly, impossibly, warm beneath his feet. He crouched down, pulled off a mitten, and pressed his bare palm flat against the wood. It was solid, dry, and possessed a gentle, living warmth. He looked at the stove. The fire inside was small, placid. A few logs burned with a steady orange glow. It was not the roaring, frantic inferno that was consuming his own home. He looked at the wood box beside it. It was more than half full. Vance turned to Silas, his voice a hoarse whisper, cracked with cold and astonishment. "Silas, how? Your fire? It's barely a light." Silas Thorne looked up from his carving, his expression calm, as if this were the most normal day in the world. "It is enough," he said. Vance, the practical man, the man of numbers and measures, needed data. He needed something to anchor his shattered reality. "How much wood?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "How much wood have you burned since this cold set in?" "The last 4 days." Silas paused his whittling and gestured with his knife toward the wood box. "What you see taken from that pile, not even a quarter of a cord, I reckon." The numbers landed on Elias Vance like a physical blow, a quarter of a cord. He, in his expertly built cabin, had burned through a quart and a half, 6 times the amount of fuel, 6 times the labor. And for what? Or for a home of ice and misery, while Silas Thorne's family lived in a bubble of springtime. The numbers were not just numbers. They were a verdict. They were an irrefutable, crushing judgment on a lifetime of certainty. It was all there: the barefoot children, the small, steady fire, the half-full woodbox, the clean, dry air. It was a constellation of impossible facts. Vance looked from the children playing on the warm floor to the gentle fire, to the quiet, unassuming man in the chair. He saw the simple, profound truth of the world Silas had built. All of his own expertise, his reputation, his deeply held beliefs about the right way to build, all of it crumbled to dust in the face of this warm, dry room. He, the respected expert, had been the fool. And Silas, the ridiculed outsider, was the master. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the warm air, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of his admission. "I was wrong, Silas," he said, the words tasting of ash and humility. "I was completely wrong. My family is freezing. My floors are sheets of ice. You have built a summer's day in the heart of this blizzard." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "You must teach me. You have to teach me how this works." When the great cold finally broke, the stories that emerged were harrowing. Tales of lost livestock, of men suffering frost-bitten hands and feet while huddled inside their own homes, of families pushed to the brink of starvation and despair. But amidst the litany of suffering, a different story began to circulate. It was the story of the Thorne cabin. At first, it was whispered as a rumor, an unbelievable tale. But it was a rumor with a powerful witness. Elias Vance, a man whose word was as solid as the oak he built with, began to tell everyone what he had seen. He described the barefoot children, the small fire, the dry walls. He did not soften his own role in the story. "I called him a fool," he would say to any who would listen, his voice ringing with the conviction of a convert. "I mocked him at every turn. And I am here to tell you that he is the wisest builder in this territory." Vance became the innovation's greatest champion. That spring, as the thaw came and the ground softened, he was the first to be at Silas's door, not as a skeptic, but as an apprentice. He spent days with Silas, learning the principles, sketching diagrams in a small notebook, asking questions about depth, volume, and ventilation. He then led the charge. He helped his neighbors excavate beneath their existing cabins, a brutal, back-breaking task of jacking up the structures to dig out the earth beneath them. He supervised the hauling of charcoal and the laying of the tarred canvas. The name Thorne's Folly was never spoken again. Instead, people began to call it the Thorne Foundation, or more simply, the Breathing Floor. The transformation of the community was not immediate, but it was profound. The next winter was a normal one, harsh but not historic, and for the handful of families who had undertaken the arduous process of retrofitting their homes, it was a revelation. Their cabins were warmer, dramatically so, but more importantly, they were dry. The perpetual damp was gone. The mildew smell vanished. The creeping frost on the walls never appeared. Silas Thorne never sought credit or fame. He became an unassuming teacher, patiently explaining the principles of his system to anyone who asked. He would take a stick and draw in the dirt, showing how the earth's warmth and the charcoal work together. A simple, elegant system in harmony with the forces of nature, not in opposition to them. He remained the quiet Cornish miner, more comfortable with the logic of rock and water than the complexities of praise. Over the next decade, nearly every home in the valley was built or rebuilt using his method. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved, though those metrics were impressive. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the sharp decline in winter sicknesses that had once plagued the children. And it was measured in the comfort of an old man able to walk across his floor without his joints seizing in pain. It was measured in the newfound security of knowing that your home was a true sanctuary against the brutal wilderness, not just a temporary shelter in a long losing war. It was measured in human dignity. The story of Silas Thorne and his Black Pit is more than just a tale of frontier ingenuity. It is a powerful lesson in the clash between tradition and innovation, between established wisdom and observational genius. It demonstrates how knowledge from one discipline, the dark, suffocating world of deep earth mining, can provide a revolutionary solution in a completely different context. The chorus of mockery Silas faced serves as a timeless reminder of the arrogance of dismissing what we do not understand. The respected expert, Elias Vance, was not a villain. He was simply a man trapped by the limits of his own experience. His eventual humility and championing of the new idea is perhaps the most crucial part of the story, for it shows that true wisdom lies not in always being right, but in having the grace to admit when you are wrong. This principle of using a ventilated, insulated space to buffer a structure from the extremes of ground temperature and moisture lives on today. It is the ancestor of the modern encapsulated crawl space, the ventilated facade, and the principles of passive geothermal design. Silas Thorne, with his miner's intuition, was practicing a sophisticated form of building science a century before the term even existed. If this story of how ancient knowledge can solve modern problems resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of forgotten wisdom from the frontiers of history. Tell us in the comments, what is the coldest winter you have ever had to endure? This narrative is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and scientific principles described, such as the use of charcoal as a desiccant and insulator, passive ventilation, and geothermal buffering, are based on real-world concepts. The characters, specific events, and location are products of historical imagination. The content presented here does not constitute professional building or engineering advice.